In this lesson, we want to talk about the irreducible minimum of the gospel. What in the world would be the irreducible minimum of the gospel? Well, the gospel is the good news of God's love. And in the scripture, we have that good news summarized into its smallest component. Actually, it's not just the gospel, it's the whole of the biblical message. Jesus told us that all of the law and the prophets are summarized into these two commandments. Number one, love God. Number two, love your neighbor. But there's a very interesting further reduction, which I like to think about as the irreducible minimum of God's commands to us. In the New Testament, there are 6 passages which are referred to as the Great Commandment. And those commandments are, number 1, to love God, and the second is to love our neighbor. But in those 6 passages, we have a difference. 3 of them refer to loving God and loving your neighbor. And the other 3 include only one of those 2. Which one of those 2 would you think would be the number 1 priority? Many people think it would be loving God. But that's not what we find. When we look at those 6 passages, we find 3 of them summarize the Great Commandment into only one of those 2 commands. And that command is to love your neighbor. So the irreducible minimum of God's instructions to us is to love our neighbor. Why? Because that's the way the primary way that we demonstrate our love for our God. Well, what's the implication of that? Well, the first point is that we show our love for God when we obey Him in loving our neighbor. The second point is that if we don't love and serve our neighbor, we don't love God. That's the point of the irreducible minimum. It's all summarized into this commandment of love your neighbor. So if we don't love our neighbor, we don't love God. That was the point of the parable of the Good Samaritan. The third point is that humble, loving, sacrificial, and joyful service is Christ's way to love. In Philippians chapter 2, we see that Jesus came to us as a servant, and He loved us obediently. He loved us humbly. He loved us sacrificially. And in Hebrews, we see that He served us joyfully. But for the joy of the cross, He served us. So, the final point of this lesson is that the way we know we are loved is when we are served. So, to summarize this lesson, number 1, we show our love for God when we love our neighbor. And number 2, if we don't love our neighbor, we don't love God. Number 3, that humble, loving, sacrificial, and joyful service is Christ's way to love. And the fourth point is that when we are served, we know we are loved.